On Tuesday, it was announced by the US Treasury that it had imposed sanctions on 16 Russian and Chinese nationals and companies for their alleged dealings with North Korea. The Treasury stated the sanctions are in accordance with internationally agreed measures against North Korea's missile and nuclear weapons programs. Among the accusations against the companies are that of working with blacklisted individuals, aiding the development of the North Korean energy sector, and helping it place workers abroad or move money abroad. Subsequently, their US assets have been frozen and Americans have been banned from doing business with them. In response to the latest sanctions, Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov issued a statement expressing his disappointment with Washington's actions, and he indicated Russia would prepare a retaliatory response.
Against such a depressing backdrop, the lip service from American representatives about the desire to stabilise bilateral relations is extremely unconvincing. We have always and will always support resolving our existing differences through dialogue. In recent years, Washington, in theory, should have learned that for us, the language of sanctions is unacceptable.
Ryabkov nevertheless introduced a note of optimism by suggesting that Russia holds out hope that the voice of reason would prevail and that the US would see sense and come round to realising what he termed the futility and detrimental nature of continued sanctions. At the same time, he warned that Russia would prepare a response in return. Earlier, I spoke to Marcus Papadopoulos, a political analyst, and I asked him what he made of the Deputy Russian Foreign Minister's optimism that the voice of reason will prevail in Washington and they will come round to ending sanctions.
I think that if we take his comments as gospel, i.e. that he means it, I think we can say that he's being quite optimistic, indeed overly optimistic. But of course, the reality in politics, the reality in diplomacy is nothing is ever what it seems. There is not going to be a change in course in America's approach to Russia.
And this action, as well, is no doubt to pressurise Russia and China to take a tougher stance against North Korea. How likely do you think this is to happen?
The reason why the Americans, the Trump administration, is going to place sanctions on Russia is because the brutal reality for policymakers in Washington is this. Given that North Korea now has nuclear weapons and has the capacity to deliver those nuclear weapons through ICBMs, through ballistic missiles, the Americans understand that they can no longer attack North Korea. If they were to attack North Korea, the potential consequences, not just for the region, but for much of America, would be catastrophic. We know the North Koreans now have the nuclear capacity to strike not just the west coast of America, but also as far as the east coast. And the Trump administration will be very well aware of that paper that was put together by American generals in the 1990s for the Clinton administration, because Bill Clinton in the 1990s was also considering an attack on North Korea. So he asked his generals, what would the casualties be? The generals, after investigating the scenario of a war between America and North Korea, told Mr. Clinton that there would be approximately 100,000 American military casualties and 1 million South Korean casualties. So Mr. Clinton straight away discarded the option of attacking North Korea. And that was before North Korea had nuclear weapons. Now that North Korea does have nuclear weapons, there would be potentially even more American casualties than 100,000. So the Americans now have to rely on Plan B. And Plan B is to try and strangle North Korea through economic sanctions, not just on Pyongyang itself, but also on those countries that are trading with North Korea. And of course, North Korea's two main trading allies in the world are, of course, China and Russia. And the Trump administration is hoping that if the sanctions on China and Russia were to cause real economic woes for Beijing and Moscow, then the Chinese and the Russians might relent with trading with North Korea. Now, that's the hope, that's the objective of the Trump administration, but that is not how the Chinese and the Russians will respond.
Some would say Trump's hands are tied when it comes to pursuing foreign policy. Do you think that's the case? How can that be equated with his rather aggressive rhetoric towards countries such as China, Russia and North Korea?
The reality is that whoever sits in the White House, the machines of the American government, of the American political, economic, military system enclose them. And they are dictated to a very, very large extent into doing what the system wants them to do in the context of American foreign policy, in the context of how America acts on the international stage. So if Mr. Trump deep down is against this hardline rhetoric towards Russia, North Korea and Iran and Venezuela and Cuba, then he should do the decent thing and say publicly to the American people that I am being forced into doing something which I'm against. It is compromising my principles, my morals, and I'm going to resign. But of course, he's not going to do that. Obama didn't do that. George W. Bush didn't do that. Bill Clinton didn't do that. The reality is that all American presidents, more or less, follow the same foreign policy line as their predecessors. And I would add this as well. To those people who I call Trump apologists, he's the president. He knew exactly what he was entering, and we have to hold him responsible for his actions. I couldn't care less what he said last year in that election campaign. I couldn't care less what he said 5 years ago. I hold him responsible for his actions today.